Walpurgis was supposed to answer one question: how do we stop Michael? Instead, every answer made Veldora look more like the enemy's next target. AI Anime and Manga presents. Please like, comment, and subscribe. YouTube members get early access to upcoming episodes and help cover AI narration, subtitles, thumbnails, and rendering. Now, let's return to the council before the whole room realizes Veldora is the piece Michael still needs. I focused on Guy because this was the question everything else depended on. What did he plan to do about Michael?
Huh? I am going to crush him, of course.
Luminus took that in, thoughtful but unsurprised. If Michael was leading Feldway, Velzard, Deeno, and the Angels, then this was not going to be a quiet political problem. It was going to be all-out war.
I am getting pumped now!
Heck yeah! The time has come to show off what I can really do. Feldway, Michael, whoever they are, I will floor them all with a single punch.
Milim could actually back that kind of confidence up. Ramirez, on the other hand, was not exactly a punching specialist. Her labyrinth was vital to us, though, so I wisely decided not to point that out. Leon asked how large the enemy force was. Guy could only name what we knew. Feldway and Deeno among the 7 primordial angels, Michael as their supreme commander, and now Velzard as well. That made Luminus call it a Temma War. I had to stop her there. A Temma War? Apparently, once every 500 years, whoever held Ludora's ability could use Armageddon to summon an army of angels. In the past, those angels had no bodies and vanished within about a week. That little detail should have reassured me, but instead it made the bad premonition in my head worse. Seal reached the same conclusion before I even finished asking. The Forbidden Curse, Dead Birthday. Michael's side had taken Kazalim, and Kazalim had already used Dead Birthday on around 60,000 Imperial soldiers from Yuki's composite division. I had given orders to stop the ceremony if possible, but I did not know how effective that had been. Guy first assumed I meant vessels for primordials, but that was not what worried me. The 7 primordial angels already had bodies. Feldway, Deeno, Pico, and Garasha were not the issue. What scared me was the possibility that the newly summoned angels could be housed in those walking dead. Angels had only thin sentience. Put that inside a dead body with a stronger, more defined self, and we might end up facing a new species of monster with angelic powers. The room went quiet. Guy and I both admitted the same thing. If either of us were on the enemy side, we would probably try it. Failure would only cost 1 corpse. Success might create several enemies on the level of awakened demon lords. That made the other demon lords look at us like we were the problem. I objected, because thinking through the worst case did not mean I wanted it to happen. Luminus and Dagrul still took the danger seriously. Louis and Gunther would struggle against even one of those things. Several would force the demon lords themselves to brace for impact. And that was only the angel vessel problem. The whole point of a Temma War was that the angels appeared on a 500-year cycle, caused chaos, and then vanished because they lacked bodies. If Michael could get around that limit, then every assumption the demon lords had built from past wars became unreliable. We were not just dealing with a familiar disaster repeating itself. We were dealing with someone who knew the old rules and was deliberately trying to break them. Milim and Ramirez tried to cut through the tension with sheer optimism. Just beat them up. We had Veldora too, right? Unfortunately, the Veldora they were putting so much faith in was probably in the other room reading manga and mistaking it for military theory. He had recently discovered the romance of the 3 kingdoms and was already talking as if that made him a master strategist. I could see the future. He would run out of volumes and make me conjure up the rest of the series for him. Luminus brought us back down to reality. Even with Veldora on our side, the enemy having Velzard was a serious advantage. She also mentioned Velgrynd as if Velgrynd were still an enemy asset. That was when I slipped. Oh, I think we are safe when it comes to Velgrynd. I regretted saying it immediately. Everyone wanted to know why I was so sure. I had no choice but to explain that Velgrynd had escaped ultimate dominion during our battle, and that she no longer had the ultimate skill Ragule, so Michael could not control her through it anymore. The demon lords stared at me. I tried to play dumb, It had been a hard fight. My brain was working on automatic. Somehow the victory had fallen into my lap. Completely normal, nothing suspicious. Guy did not buy it. I refused to explain my abilities. If I told them the truth, they would not believe me anyway, and even if they did, it would only make them more suspicious. So I leaned on a safer explanation. Skills can evolve in extreme battle. Velgrynd's situation was like that. Ragul had changed and she regained herself. It was not the whole truth. It was not even close to the whole truth. But Leon understood the idea. He had gained Metatron by wagering everything on his own potential between life and death, and he had no regrets. That helped settle the topic. Since we were trying to get our information straight, I added one more piece. Feldway had brought 3 mystic leaders into Ramirez's labyrinth. One of them, Cornu, had already been destroyed by Velgrynd. That reduced the enemy count even if I did not want to underestimate them. Cornu had not seemed as formidable as Feldway or Zerario, but Velgrynd destroying him in one blow was still terrifying. Guy knew Cornu and did not look especially mournful about losing him. From his point of view, one enemy was simply off the board. I could not tell whether that was Demon Lord pragmatism or just Guy being Guy. But either way it mattered. Cornu's death meant Feldway's forces were not untouched, and Velgrynd was not just free from Michael. She had already proven she could erase one of his ranking officers. Then Milim raised her hand.
Hey now, seems like a good time for this. I got something to report too!
Her report was the payoff to the uneasy thread from earlier. One of the mystic leaders, Obela, had secretly asked to serve under Milim. Feldway and the others did not seem to know. My first reaction was not joy, it was suspicion. Guy and I asked Milim the same question almost at the same time. How did she win Obela over? Guy knew Obela as a serious woman, not someone he expected to switch sides lightly. I remembered the old pretend surrender trick from war stories and warned Milim that an enemy defection right before a war was exactly the kind of thing we should question. Milim only smiled. She had doubted Obela too, then talked things over with Carrera and Frey. All 3 of them had agreed to trust her. Milim was reckless sometimes, but she was not stupid. If Carrera and Frey had signed off as well, then this deserved a fair hearing. Once Milim finished explaining the details, the picture became clearer. Obela was in the Mystic Palace, keeping watch over Ivalage, the World Destroyer Dragon. If she abandoned that duty, Ivalage and its cryptids could break loose. That meant Obela probably did not have the freedom to participate in Feldway's invasion even if she wanted to. I still wondered whether Feldway might release Ivalage deliberately if he truly did not care whether the world survived. The others rejected that idea quickly. Feldway might be dangerous, but using an uncontrollable world-destroying dragon was different from using a weapon. You could not rule a world after it had been torn apart. The more they talked, the clearer Obela's position became. She had not come to Milim with a full map of Feldway's plans. She had not offered convenient answers to every question. What she did offer was a motive that fit. Loyalty to Veldanava, concern for Milim, and refusal to follow Feldway and Michael into a resurrection plan that might destroy the world their master had left behind. That did not make her harmless, but it made her report feel less like bait. Milim immediately wanted to fight Ivalage if it ever appeared. Everyone stopped her at once. Guy finally declared that if Ivalage revived, he would handle it. His voice carried enough pressure that nobody argued. Obela's intelligence remained limited. She did not know much about the forces Feldway had placed in this world, probably because Feldway gave his subordinates only what they needed to know. Oddly enough, that made me trust her more. If she wanted to deceive us, she could have offered a pile of false intelligence. Saying she did not know was more believable. For now, we leaned toward trusting Obela and watching how things developed. With that settled, we returned to the enemy lineup. I made the mistake of asking if anyone else had secrets they were not sharing, and every demon lord in the room threw the accusation right back at me. Fair point, I probably had the most secrets of anyone there. Luminus stepped in and summarized the threat. Michael led the enemy. Velzard was under his rule. Feldway was the Mystic Lord, with Zerario among the Mystic leaders. Zerario watched the Insectors led by Zerenius, and that force worried me more than I wanted to admit. The insectors I knew were frighteningly strong: Zegian, Apito, Razul, Manaza. If Serenius had more like them, we had a serious problem. Then there were Deeno, Pico, and Garasha. Each was powerful enough to compare with an awakened demon lord, and it would be safer to assume they had ultimate skills of their own. And finally, there were the walking dead that might be carrying angels. It was an ugly list because none of the categories solved the others. Velzard was a true dragon-level crisis by herself. Feldway was both a commander and a frontline monster. The insectors were an unknown military force. Deeno and the other angels were ancient beings whose abilities we had not measured. The walking dead might turn into disposable vessels for Seraphim. We could not build a plan around one decisive duel and call that enough. Dagrel wondered if we should assign each demon lord a target. That sounded neat on paper, but it ignored the obvious risk. Leon could not fight Michael. If Michael gained control of Leon through Metatron, the balance of power would swing instantly. I added that Michael's control abilities could probably be transferred to others, at least partially. Feldway might be borrowing the same power like Lieutenant Kondo had, so Leon needed to avoid Feldway too. Then I remembered the bigger problem. Veldora had already been taken over once. That forced me to explain Regalia Dominion, Michael's ability to exert absolute control over a target. I avoided talking about Chloe since she had already handled her own situation. I kept the explanation focused on Veldora's battle. Once again, everyone stared at me. Guy reminded me that I had just asked whether anyone else had secrets. I tried to claim this was something I had merely forgotten, not hidden. Nobody believed me. The important distinction was this. Ultimate Dominion could quietly influence someone with an angelic skill. But Regalia Dominion was more forceful. When it hit Veldora, he lost himself immediately and told me through our soul connection that he had been taken over. That meant we could notice when it happened, even if stopping it was another issue. Luminus asked how I freed Veldora. The true answer was that I ate him and Seal adjusted his abilities. There was no way I was saying that out loud. So I used the same story as Velgrynd: intense battle, ability evolution, and the power of friendship. The silence that followed was painful. Guy pointed out that he had fought Velzard very hard and her skills had not evolved. I said it probably varied from dragon to dragon. He did not seem convinced. Seal quietly warned me that telling the truth would make everyone ask me to fight anyone who got mind-controlled, and then they would start dissecting my abilities. Keeping quiet was definitely the right move. Luminus finally cut through the deadlock. Whether they believed my explanation or not, Regalia Dominion was at least visible when it happened. The real question was how to counter Michael's force. That distinction mattered for morale. Ultimate Dominion was frightening because the victim might not realize anything was wrong. Regalia Dominion was frightening because it could force a true dragon to move against us. But if the effect appeared immediately, we could at least react. We could isolate the victim, call for help, and avoid mistaking an enemy-controlled ally for a normal ally making a bad decision. I suggested we stop trying to decide neat duels and instead plan around where the enemy might attack. Everyone had territories to defend. Luminus would not abandon Lubelius unless it was the last resort. Dagrel and Milim had their own lands. Leon had El Dorado. I would defend Tempest with my life. So we needed fast communication and reinforcements that could move to any threatened front. Guy agreed, then immediately turned that agreement into my problem. He wanted me to deploy Tempest personnel to Luminus, Dagrel, Milim, and Leon and set up transport circles in each domain so people could move quickly. I wanted to tell him I was not his employee. Unfortunately, Guy was serious, and when Guy was serious, it was easier to surrender early. The transport circles were the key part, no matter how much I wanted to complain. A messenger was too slow. Ordinary travel was too slow. Even thought communication only helped if the people receiving the warning could actually arrive before the enemy finished the attack. If Michael chose one battlefield and concentrated his forces there, every minute would count. The circles would turn separate defensive positions into a single loose network. I needed people who could operate independently, communicate by thought communication, travel quickly, and resist mind control. Testarossa was tied up with Eastern Empire schemes, So Carrera and Ultima became the obvious Demoness candidates. Some of my cabinet would have to go too. I started with Milim. Geld was the best fit for her domain because construction there needed to resume and everyone loved him. Milim also wanted Gabriel to spar with Midray again. Since Ultima was already training Gabriel, and since I could call them back if needed, I assigned Geld, Gabriel, and Ultima to Milim's domain. For Luminus, I asked before making assumptions. I had learned not to step on landmines. She requested Xion, who had visited Lubelius before and whose violin skills Luminus remembered fondly. I added Adelman and his assistants, since Adelman knew Luminus and had teleportation experience. Luminus accepted, though the idea of teaching Adelman something seemed to amuse her. Then came Daggrel. I suggested Carrera. Daggrel nearly exploded. He knew Carrera as Jeanne, the original, and apparently her reputation in Damergania was terrible. Luminus backed him up, pointing out that when I said Ultima, I meant Violet. Daggrel looked even more distressed. They began listing the insane things I had done which felt unfair. Yes, I had several primordial-level demons working for me. No, I did not appreciate everyone treating my personnel decisions like crimes. Daggrel refused Carrera outright. To him, sending her to Damergania meant his country would fall in days. Leon, normally calm, joined in with stories of her violent streak and daily destruction near his territory. That made me consider sending Carrera to Leon instead, partly because Guy would be there to restrain her and partly because Leon's reaction was funny. Leon refused with absolute force. Guy stopped me too. Carrera liked picking fights with him, and if she started anything during a war, he did not want to waste stamina on the distraction. Ramirez added that Carrera had tried to make a game out of punching holes through as many labyrinth floors as possible. Apparently Diablo was supposed to supervise her, which let me deflect responsibility in his direction. Milim, bless her reckless heart, offered to host Carrera as a guest. Problem solved. Carrera would go to Milim, and Ultima would go to Daggrel. Daggrel tried to object, but I chose not to hear it. Guy took that as settled. In practical terms, the revised assignments made sense. Milim's domain would get Geld, Gabriel, and Carrera, with Carrera serving as outrageous firepower under a ruler outrageous enough to tolerate her. Luminus would get Xion, Adelman, and his assistants, which gave Lubelius both muscle and disciplined magic. Daggrel would get Ultima, whether he liked it or not. Each post would also connect back through the transport circles, so nobody was supposed to be left isolated if Velzard or another major enemy appeared. That left Leon. I argued that if Guy was already going to El Dorado, I should not have to dilute Tempest's forces any further. Guy accused me of being stingy when I was practically swimming in million-class underlings. He even suggested Benimaru. Absolutely not. Benimaru had just gotten married. Both his wives were pregnant, and I was not going to be the kind of boss who shipped a man off on indefinite assignment during a huge family milestone. I remembered the old corporate stories from Japan, where companies sent employees away at the worst possible time just to test loyalty. No way was I bringing that injustice into my nation. Then I remembered Diablo. He was always standing near me, so I kept forgetting he could be deployed too. If Xion was leaving, sending Diablo out also made sense. Shuna was my real secretary anyway. Guy immediately realized what I was doing. I pressed the point. I had already offered my best people. I was not passing out personnel for fun. Diablo was strong enough to work alone, and if Leon had trouble with him, I could re-educate him later. Guy stared at me. I stayed dignified on the outside and sweated on the inside. Finally, he gave in. Diablo would go to El Dorado with Guy and Leon. Leon used the opportunity to invite me to visit his nation someday, since he had promised before and never followed through. I accepted, as long as our schedules worked out and Chloe stayed out of it. She needed rest, and explaining that would create more trouble than it solved. At last, the private deployment plan was set. We returned to the large reception hall where the attendants were waiting. Guy immediately announced that he would leave with Leon and expected everyone to act as directed. Carrion and Frey objected reasonably enough because nobody had explained what direction we were taking. Since Guy, Milim, Ramirez, Daggrel, Leon, and Luminus were all terrible candidates for a full briefing in their own unique ways, I stepped up and summarized the situation. Velzard was on the opposing side, not because she had simply betrayed us, but because Michael controlled her. The enemy included Michael, Feldway, Velzard, Deeno and the Angels, Zerario and the Insectors, possible Walking Dead angel vessels, and the unknown force around Xeranus. The Demon Lords had agreed to strengthen communication, establish transport circles, and send reinforcements to vulnerable domains. I also made sure the attendants understood the shape of the danger instead of only the names. A controlled ally could become an enemy without warning. A familiar 500-year angel invasion might no longer fade out after a week. A demon lord with an angelic skill could become a control risk. And if the enemy concentrated power at one target, nobody was allowed to treat the crisis as someone else's local problem. Frey quickly understood the severity. Carolyn tried to sound bold about testing himself against a true dragon, but even he was sweating. Veldora laughed and offered to be his first test instead. Ramirez told him this was not the time. Frey then asked whether Veldora could resist Regalia Dominion at all. I explained that he could if his will was strong enough. The enemy had caught him in the middle of a battle against his sister, when his resistance was at its lowest. Veldora tried to downplay it, claiming it was merely difficult. Difficult, my foot. He got brainwashed. Daggerel seized the chance to ask if Veldora could come to his domain instead of Ultima. I refused. Veldora did not work for me. He was my friend and equal, so I would not decide for him. Veldora gave Daggerel the grandest refusal imaginable. He was a busy dragon, he said, and had an obligation to protect Ramirez's dungeon. In other words, he planned to stay in the labyrinth and waste time as usual. Still, I was relieved. Daggerel needed help, but Tempest needed Veldora. Milim, for once, was completely practical about it. Velzard was dangerous enough that if she attacked any domain, that demon lord might be forced to focus entirely on her. We needed instant contact and support, not lone heroics. Milim wanted Geld and Gabil sent over quickly. I promised to brief them and send them after I returned. Geld had transport gate skills, so there was no need for panic. Frey promised they would contact us at once if the enemy attacked. She still did not seem to realize Carrera was a primal demon, and I decided that silence was the kindest option. Then Louis asked the question that reopened the deepest problem. What did Michael actually want? I explained what Obela had reported. Michael and Feldway were trying to resurrect Veldanava. The attendants were shocked. The Demon Lords already knew, but for everyone else, it was a lot to absorb. Milim confirmed it, then realized she had not properly told Carrera and Frey. Frey immediately decided Midray needed a serious follow-up interrogation. I could not judge them too harshly. I had forgotten important details today, too. Louis pointed out that a true dragon was immortal. Veldanava should eventually revive on his own. Luminus answered that Michael was a self-aware entity in the form of a skill and might think in ways no ordinary person would. Guy understood the emotional logic too. Veldanava had shown no signs of returning, and Feldway might be desperate enough to destroy the world while chasing him. I asked whether death might change Veldanava's memories and personality. To me, that mattered. Luminus treated it as little more than an aesthetic difference because the soul would be the same. Velgrynd had said something similar about Ludora. To long-lived beings like them, good and evil might be temporary labels, but I could not accept that so easily. My human values still mattered to me. If I ever let my selfishness hurt others in the name of my own happiness, I would become exactly the kind of despot Maribel feared. That was why Michael and Feldway's obsession felt so dangerous to me. Even if their grief or loyalty was real, they were willing to trample the present world for a version of the past they wanted back. Maybe immortals could call that devotion. From my point of view, it was still a path that made everyone else pay the price. While I was reminding myself not to lose that line, Guy asked a sharper question. How did Michael intend to awaken Veldanava? At first, I was ready to say I had no idea, but then I remembered. Veldora remembered too. Diablo explained it before I could get the words straight. Michael believed that by bringing together the draconic factors of 3 true dragons, Veldanava would be reborn. It sounded foolish, but we could not completely dismiss it. Ciel reminded me that I possessed draconic factors as well, since I had become something like a true dragon. Still, even collecting Velzard, Velgrynd, and Veldora should not be enough. Without Veldanava's own soul, the result would be a pseudo-copy at best. Guy agreed. A body without the proper soul was not the same being. Diablo wondered whether a completed vessel might give the lost soul a place to return. Luminus admitted it was not impossible. CL rejected that line. If Veldanava wished to return, he could simply recreate his own body. Then Luminus reached the practical conclusion before the rest of us. Maybe the enemy's true goal was Veldora. The room stopped. Veldora made a confused little noise, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just become the center of the enemy's plan. It made sense. Veldora had been controlled once, but his draconic factors had not been taken. Milim remembered Obela saying that Michael had already taken in Velgrynd's draconic factors. If Velzard was under his control now too, then Veldora was the only remaining true dragon not in Michael's collection. Guy panicked for Velzard, worried that having her factors taken might destroy her. I explained that in Velgrynd's case, Michael had only taken one of her parallel existences, maybe a tenth of her overall energy, and even that had pushed him to the limit. A true dragon could not be swallowed whole so easily. I also reasoned that Michael could take abilities along with draconic factors, but doing so might risk his control over angelic skills. At first I thought he would weaken Velzard, take what he needed and banish her to avoid retaliation. Then Guy challenged the logic. If Michael could control Velzard and use her abilities through that control, why steal everything and send her away? Good point. I hated when my brilliant theories collapsed that fast. Seal helped me sort through Velgrynd's case. When Michael took a portion of her draconic factors, she was already near the edge, but losing factors was not the same as having her soul destroyed. If she recovered after being released from control, she might remember what happened and come after Michael for revenge. Banishment made sense as a precaution. That did not prove he would use the exact same method on Velzard, but it showed the kind of risk he was willing to manage. Dagrel and Luminus helped untangle it. Maybe Michael did not need every ability. Maybe he only cared about abilities Veldanava once possessed, or only about what he considered pure. But that still did not fully fit. Skills could be recreated. Abilities might be useful to Michael, but they were probably a bonus, not the core of the resurrection plan. So I returned to what we actually knew. The draconic factors mattered. Michael had said so. Everything else was speculation. If abilities were the main issue, there were more people than Leon we would need to watch. But if draconic factors were the core, then the simplest priority was obvious. Keep Veldora away from the enemy. Guy did not like leaving the ability question unanswered, but he accepted my conclusion. That meant preventing Velzard and Veldora from facing each other. Naturally, he counted on me for that. That also explained why Leon remained important without making him the only problem. Metatron exposed him to Michael's control system, so we could not let him face Michael or Feldway carelessly. But Leon was not the centerpiece of the resurrection theory. Veldora was. Protecting Leon prevented a disastrous power swing. Protecting Veldora prevented Michael from reaching the most concrete piece of his plan. I could have complained that he was pushing more responsibility onto me, but by then I wanted the meeting to end more than I wanted to argue. Veldora, of course, immediately puffed himself up.
Oh, I knew it. I knew I would be so extremely important in all this, eh?
I do not think anyone would blame me for getting a little irritated. The truth was that we were several steps behind the enemy. We had to admit that. But we could still catch up. Veldora had no angelic skill, and he had already slipped free from Regalia Dominion once. Michael's side knew that too, so the next attempt would probably be direct and overwhelming. That meant total war. Our first objective was to gather and protect everyone with angelic skills, keep fast communication open, use the transport circles, and prevent the enemy from reaching Veldora. In the worst case, I might even have to cut out the override circuit inside Leon, though I really preferred not to. Guy finally closed the council.
All right, everyone. Good luck out there. If something happens, drop me a line immediately.
And with that, the Walpurgis Council was finally wrapped up. Cooperation had not exactly been the main theme of this conference. In fact, there had been almost none of it at all. But at least, after all that talking, it was over at long last.
Route confirmed. The next episode and full playlist are ready.
Then don't stop here. Keep watching in story order and subscribe before the next part drops.